The Cleveland Browns didn't just make roster moves this week, they sent a message. And whether they meant to or not, that message revealed just how deep the panic inside the building really is. Because when an organization starts cutting offensive linemen, making emergency signings, and reshuffling protection midstream, it's usually not part of some long-term master plan. It's reaction, damage control, and in this case, the timing says everything. This all happened right after Shedeur Sanders walked off the field having faced a pressure rate so extreme it rewrote the history books. Not one of the worst, not near the top. The worst recorded since modern tracking began. Nearly half the time he dropped back, someone was in his face. That's not football adversity, that's organizational failure. And now, suddenly, the Browns are scrambling, cutting here, signing there, as if they just realized what everyone else already saw on tape. The question is why it took this long, and who's really being protected in the fallout. Because here, where things get uncomfortable. Despite the chaos up front, despite missed blocks and collapsing pockets, the conversation keeps circling back to the quarterback. His completion percentage, his adjustment period, his responsibility. Meanwhile, the infrastructure around him quietly escapes the same level of scrutiny. Fans are furious, analysts are raising eyebrows, and respected voices are starting to ask whether Cleveland crossed a line from poor planning into something far more serious. This isn't just about bad protection anymore. It's about accountability and who actually takes the blame when systems fail. And once you trace what happened next, from press conferences to front office panic, you'll understand why this situation is quickly becoming one of the most alarming stories in the NFL right now. The number that finally snapped everything into focus wasn't subjective. It wasn't narrative-driven. It was pure data, and it was impossible to ignore. Against Chicago, Shedeur Sanders was pressured on 48% of his dropbacks. Nearly half the time he took the snap, someone was already breaking through. That figure isn't just bad, it's historic. According to modern NFL tracking, no quarterback has faced a higher single-game pressure rate since ESPN began recording the stat back in 2009. Let that sink in. This wasn't a rookie struggling to adjust. This wasn't a quarterback holding the ball too long. This was a protection unit collapsing at a level the league almost never sees. And once that stat became public, everything Cleveland did afterwards suddenly made sense. Because teams don't panic over bad games. They panic over evidence. That pressure rate immediately set off alarms around the league. Analysts started comparing it to games where quarterbacks were pulled for safety reasons. Former players openly questioned how any offense could function under those conditions. And fans weren't debating anymore. They were demanding answers. What made it worse was the context. The Chicago Bears aren't an all-time dominant pass-rushing unit. This wasn't a matchup against a historically elite front, which made the number even more damning. If this could happen here, it could happen anywhere. And that's where the Cleveland Browns found themselves cornered. Because once that statistic hit the public, there was no spinning it. No coaching cliché could smooth it over. No, we'll clean it up on tape could explain away a number that extreme. It was proof that the system protecting Sanders had failed completely. That's why the roster moves came so fast. That's why linemen were cut. That's why emergency signings followed. This wasn't strategy unfolding, it was a response to exposure. And yet, here's the part that still doesn't sit right with fans. Despite this historic failure up front, the immediate discussion didn't center on protection schemes or personnel planning. It centered on Sanders' stat line, his efficiency, his learning curve, as if surviving that level of pressure should still come with clean numbers. That disconnect is what turned frustration into outrage. Because when the worst pressure game in modern NFL history happens on your watch, the conversation shouldn't start with the quarterback. It should start with the people responsible for keeping him upright. And once you see how Cleveland responded internally to that reality, the next chapter gets even more revealing. What happened next told everyone exactly how seriously Cleveland took that pressure stat, even if they'd never admit it publicly. Within days, the Cleveland Browns front office went into full scramble mode. Offensive linemen were cut, emergency signings were announced, practice squad players were elevated. The protection unit was reshuffled so quickly it felt less like planning and more like triage. This wasn't the slow, deliberate approach teams take when they believe in their process. This was a reaction, a hard pivot, the kind you make when something has gone very wrong and you need to show action immediately. At the center of it all was Andrew Berry. Publicly, these moves were framed as normal roster management. Privately, at least according to how fast they happened, it looked like damage control. Because front offices don't overhaul protection units mid-season unless they feel exposed. And exposed is exactly what that Bears game did. Fans noticed the timing instantly. The cuts didn't come after weeks of poor play. They came after one historic collapse that couldn't be explained away. The kind of game that forces ownership meetings, emergency evaluations, and uncomfortable internal conversations. What made the situation even more confusing was who got cut. Some of the moves felt random, others felt rushed, and instead of calming the fan base, they did the opposite. People started asking if Cleveland even had a plan, or if they were just throwing bodies at the problem hoping something would stick. That confusion mattered, because stability is critical for offensive line play. Chemistry takes time, communication takes reps, and yet Sanders was being asked to adjust again, new faces, new tendencies, new breakdown risks, all while already under historic pressure. Which led to another uncomfortable realization. If these changes were truly necessary, why weren't they made earlier? And if they weren't necessary, why make them now? That contradiction is what fueled the backlash. Because to many fans, this didn't look like proactive leadership. It looked like an organization reacting after the damage was done, not before. And when panic sets in at the top, it trickles down fast. But the most revealing part was still to come. Because while the front office scrambled behind the scenes, the public messaging went in a completely different direction. One that shifted responsibility away from structure and straight onto the quarterback. And that's where the double standard became impossible to ignore. The most revealing moment didn't happen on the field. It happened behind a podium. Less than 24 hours after that Chicago disaster, Shedeur Sanders stepped into the media room. And considering what he had just endured, the way he handled it caught a lot of people off guard. Calm, measured, professional, no frustration, no excuses. Reporters, however, went in a very different direction. Instead of pressing the obvious issues, protection breakdowns, missed assignments, structural chaos, the focus zeroed in on Sanders' completion percentage. Questions were framed to force comparison with his college numbers. The implication was clear: something is wrong with the quarterback. And Sanders took it. He talked about adjustments, about learning the speed of the league, about improving week by week. He didn't point fingers. He didn't mention pressure. He didn't bring up the fact that he just faced the worst protection any quarterback has seen in modern NFL tracking. That restraint wasn't accidental, it was leadership, and it was political awareness. But then came the next press conference. When offensive coordinator Tommy Rees addressed the media, the tone shifted completely. Suddenly, the issues weren't specific anymore. Missed assignments became collective execution. Late calls became communication challenges. And then came the explanation that raised eyebrows everywhere. Weather, cold conditions, a headset issue in an NFL game. Fans didn't buy it, and neither did a lot of analysts. This is a league that plays through snowstorms in Buffalo and sub-zero games in Green Bay. Suggesting technology failed because it was cold felt less like an explanation and more like deflection. Then Reese said the line that stuck. There's not one player at fault, not one coach at fault. That's when the double standard snapped into focus. Because when systems fail, responsibility suddenly becomes shared, vague, collective. But when box score numbers dip, when efficiency looks ugly, the blame gets specific and it lands on the quarterback. That contrast didn't go unnoticed. Fans started pointing out the imbalance. Sanders absorbs the hits, answers the questions, shoulders the criticism. Meanwhile, structural failures get softened by language and buried under cliches. And once people noticed that pattern, they couldn't stop seeing it. Because accountability in the NFL is supposed to flow upward, not just downward. And that realization set the stage for the most dramatic shift yet. When ownership finally entered the conversation, and the panic moved from press rooms to the front office itself. The moment ownership gets involved, everything changes. And in Cleveland, that moment arrived faster than anyone expected. Behind the scenes, frustration had been building for weeks. But after the Chicago game, after the pressure numbers went public and the backlash intensified, it became impossible to ignore. That's when Jimmy Haslam reportedly started asking hard questions about what was actually happening inside his own organization. Because from an ownership perspective, this wasn't just about wins and losses anymore. This was about asset protection. A young quarterback taking historic levels of pressure isn't just a football problem, it's a business risk. Confidence gets shaken, development stalls, and if the situation spirals, the long-term value of the position everyone depends on takes a hit. That's when patience disappears. Almost immediately, the tone shifted. Roster decisions that once felt deliberate suddenly felt rushed. Offensive linemen were cycled through at an alarming rate. Practice squad players were elevated. Emergency signings were made with little runway to integrate. And all of it happened fast, too fast for this to be part of some carefully mapped out plan. That's why fans started using one phrase over and over: panic. Because when ownership pressure meets front office reality, the result usually isn't elegance, it's reaction. And that reaction signaled something important. Cleveland knew the situation had crossed a line. What made this even more revealing was the lack of a clear message. There was no unified explanation, no confident roadmap, just movement, action for the sake of action. And while movement can look decisive, it can also expose uncertainty. For Andrew Barry, this created a tightrope. Do nothing and it looks like negligence. Move too fast and it looks like desperation. Either way, the spotlight stays on. And that spotlight made one thing painfully clear. Whatever the original plan was for protecting Shedeur Sanders, it wasn't working. And now, the organization was scrambling to fix it after the damage had already been done. That's the part fans can't get past. Because great teams anticipate problems. They don't wait for historic failures to force their hand. And once ownership has to intervene, it's usually a sign that internal checks failed long before the public ever noticed. But the most alarming realization came next. When you actually look at who was on the field protecting Sanders that day, the chaos makes far more sense, and the picture gets even uglier. Once fans stopped arguing about blame and actually looked at the personnel, the conversation took a darker turn. Because the question wasn't why protection failed anymore. It was how it ever had a chance to work in the first place. Go back to that Bears game and look at who was actually lining up in front of Shedeur Sanders. This wasn't a settled unit. It wasn't a group that had spent months building chemistry. It was a patchwork lineup stitched together out of necessity. Late-season additions, emergency replacements, players rotating in and out of unfamiliar positions with almost no margin for error. At left tackle, you had Cam Robinson, a journeyman still learning the system. At guard, Joel Bitonio, respected, experienced but physically incapable of compensating for breakdowns happening on both sides at once. The interior shuffled constantly. Assignments changed mid-game. Communication suffered, and every defensive stunt became a gamble. It got worse as the game went on. Injuries forced even more reshuffling. Players slid into roles they hadn't practiced. Emergency backups were asked to make protection calls against NFL fronts designed to exploit hesitation. And every time that hesitation showed up, Sanders paid for it. This wasn't an excuse, it was context. Offensive line play depends on continuity, timing, trust. One missed signal can collapse an entire play. Now imagine asking a quarterback to operate behind a group that hasn't had time to establish any of that, while defenses tee off knowing pressure will get home. That's not development, that's survival. Fans finally started connecting the dots. This wasn't one lineman failing. It wasn't one coach missing adjustments. It was systemic instability, a rotating door up front that guaranteed breakdowns before the ball was even snapped. And yet, despite all of this, the expectation remained the same. Sanders was still supposed to produce clean numbers, still supposed to look composed, still supposed to mask chaos with poise, which he often did until the hits added up. That's why the outrage grew louder, because once people realized who was actually blocking, the historic pressure rate stopped being shocking and started being inevitable. And then came the most uncomfortable layer of the story, the whispers about effort, frustration, and what might be happening inside that locker room. Once the personnel chaos became impossible to deny, the conversation took a turn most people were hesitant to make publicly. Not because it was proven, but because it was uncomfortable. There's been a lot of buzz online, with rumors suggesting that frustration inside the locker room may be playing a role in what fans are seeing on the field. To be clear, there is no verified evidence of intentional wrongdoing or coordinated failure. No reports, no confirmations, just whispers and patterns that people are struggling to explain. Some fans have speculated that not everyone on the offensive line is fully bought into the situation. Others claim there's resentment tied to attention, pressure, and expectations surrounding Shedeur Sanders. Again, speculation, but speculation that didn't appear out of thin air. It emerged because of effort questions on tape. On certain snaps, blocks don't just fail, they disappear. Assignments are missed clean. Hands don't engage. Recovery never comes. And when those moments repeat in high-leverage situations, viewers naturally start asking questions, not accusing, questioning. Former players online have weighed in cautiously, saying the difference between getting beat and hesitating is obvious to trained eyes. And hesitation, especially at the offensive line position, is deadly. It doesn't require bad intent. Sometimes it's mental. Sometimes it's frustration. Sometimes it's a breakdown in trust. And that's where things get tricky. There have also been reports claiming that some linemen have privately commented on Sanders, playing style in the spotlight that follows him. Nothing official, nothing on record, but enough chatter to raise eyebrows, especially when combined with visible breakdowns on game day. Still, one thing is clear. None of that justifies what's happening on the field. If frustration exists, it's the responsibility of leadership to address it. Coaches manage egos. Veterans set standards. Organizations ensure alignment. When that doesn't happen, dysfunction creeps in quietly, and it shows up in effort, communication, and execution. What makes this situation even more lopsided is how blame is distributed. Dropped passes by Jerry Jeudy fade from the conversation. Missed blocks get softened, but every stalled drive circles back to the quarterback. And that imbalance fuels the perception that Sanders is carrying weight that isn't entirely his. Because despite all the chaos, he's still standing in the pocket, still delivering throws under pressure, still absorbing hits without pointing fingers. Which leads to the most frustrating realization of all. Even amid rumored frustration and organizational instability, Sanders continues to show the traits teams build around: poise, resilience, and competitiveness. And that makes what's happening around him feel less like growing pains and more like a failure to protect something valuable. And that brings us to the final crossroads. What Cleveland does next may define this entire era. This is the moment where everything converges. Because regardless of where you land in this debate, one truth is now impossible to ignore. The situation surrounding Shedeur Sanders is no longer just about football execution. It's about decision-making at the highest level, about whether an organization understands the responsibility that comes with developing a young quarterback, or if it's repeating mistakes it's made for decades. The Browns can call this adversity. They can frame it as growing pains. They can lean on cliches about patience and learning curves. But history doesn't care about excuses. It only remembers outcomes. What fans are reacting to isn't one bad game or one ugly stat line. It's the accumulation, historic pressure numbers, sudden roster panic, vague accountability, and a quarterback who keeps answering for problems that clearly extend beyond him. That's why voices like Mel Kiper Jr. matter here. When experienced evaluators say the offensive line must become the top priority above everything else, they're not guessing. They're recognizing patterns the league has seen before. Talented quarterbacks don't fail in isolation. They fail when protection, structure, and trust collapse simultaneously. And right now, Cleveland is standing at a crossroads. They can keep patching the problem, shuffling linemen, deflecting blame, hopping toughness covers up instability. Or they can commit fully to fixing the foundation. Real investment, real accountability, real protection. Because drafting another quarterback won't solve this. Changing faces won't solve this. Only changing the environment will. What makes this situation so frustrating is that Sanders continues to show why people believed in him in the first place. He hasn't folded. He hasn't pointed fingers. He hasn't lost composure. He's playing through chaos, and that's not something you teach. The question now is whether he can handle the NFL. It's whether the NFL, or more specifically, Cleveland, is handling him the right way. Because franchises don't just ruin careers by making loud mistakes. They do it by ignoring quiet ones until it's too late. And if this moment isn't a wake-up call, then this won't be remembered as a rough stretch in a rookie season. It'll be remembered as the moment everyone saw the warning signs and waited too long to act.